In the shadowed heart of Valdrath, where the blood moon hung low and heavy over jagged spires of black stone, a world thrived beyond the reach of mortal eyes. This was no place for the living, not in the traditional sense, for Valdrath belonged to the vampire elite, a lineage of eternal beings whose power stretched back through centuries, their rule etched in the cold marble of their grand court. The air here carried the scent of ancient dust, mingled with the faint metallic tang of blood, a reminder of the feasts that sustained their immortality. Towers rose like the teeth of some great beast, their windows glowing with the flicker of torchlight, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestone courtyards below. It was a realm of beauty and terror, where elegance masked cruelty, and every whispered word could be a death sentence. Amid this opulence lived Kaelin, a girl of no more than 17 summers, though her life had known little of warmth or light. Born to human parents who perished in a raid by the court's enforcers, she had been taken as a child, her small hands deemed useful for the menial tasks that the vampires disdained. Her hair, once a soft brown, was now matted with grime, hanging in tangled strands over her pale face, her eyes, a sharp gray that seemed to hold a storm within, were the only hint of the fire that burned beneath her tattered cloak. She was a servant, a shadow among shadows, tasked with scrubbing floors, polishing silver, and bowing her head to beings who saw her as less than dust. To the vampire elite, Prince Darius, with his regal bearing and cold sapphire eyes, and his sister, Lady Seraphine, whose beauty was as sharp as her tongue. Kaelin was nothing, a speck of humanity in a world that had long forsaken it. The court of Valdrath was a place of strict hierarchy, where every vampire knew their place, and humans were the lowest of the low. Prince Darius, the heir to the throne, ruled with an iron will, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. His sister, Seraphine, was his shadow, her envy of his power, a quiet undercurrent that fueled her every move. Together, they presided over a council of nobles, each more ancient and ruthless than the last, their lives sustained by the blood of captives brought from distant villages. The humans of Valdrath were a resource, bred and harvested with clinical precision, and Kaelin was one of the few who survived into adolescence, her resilience a mystery even to herself. Her days began before the first light could pierce the heavy drapes of the servant quarters, a cramped room beneath the castle where the air was thick with the stench of sweat and despair. She would rise, her bones aching from the cold stone floor, and set to her tasks with a silence that had become her shield. The vampires rarely spoke to her directly, their commands relayed through overseers, hulking vampires with scarred faces who wielded whips with casual cruelty. Yet Kaelin had learned to listen, to watch, to glean what she could from the fragments of conversation that drifted her way. She heard tales of the court's origins, of a time when humans and vampires had warred, and of a bloodline of hunters who had nearly brought the vampires to ruin. These stories were whispered in the dark, dismissed as legend by the elite, but to Kaelin they were a flicker of hope, a thread of something greater than her servitude. One evening, as the blood moon reached its zenith, casting an eerie red glow through the high windows, Kaelin was summoned to the royal archives. The task was unusual, typically reserved for trusted scribes, and she approached with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The archives were a labyrinth of towering shelves, their wood blackened with age, filled with scrolls and tomes that held the court's history. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred by her hesitant steps, and the silence was broken only by the faint rustle of parchment. Her orders were simple: clean the lower shelves, remove the cobwebs, and leave no trace of her presence. But as she worked, her hand brushed against a scroll that felt different, its surface rougher, its weight heavier than the others. With trembling fingers, she unrolled it, the brittle paper crackling under her touch. The text was faded, written in a language she could barely decipher, but the illustrations told a story of their own. Figures clad in armor, wielding silver blades, stood against a horde of vampires, their faces contorted in rage. At the center was a symbol, a crescent moon scarred with a single line, identical to the mark on her wrist, a birthmark she had always hidden beneath her sleeve. Her breath caught as she traced the shape, her heart pounding with a realization she could scarcely comprehend. The scroll spoke of a bloodline, a lineage of hunters who had been blessed with the power to resist vampire dominion, their blood a weapon against the eternal. And beneath the symbol, in letters barely legible, was a name, Kaelin. She staggered back, the scroll slipping from her hands, the dagger that had been tucked within its folds clattering to the stone floor. The blade was unlike any she had seen, its hilt carved with runes, its edge gleaming with a silver light that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. For a moment, she stood frozen, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. Was this a mistake? A cruel jest by the fates? But the mark on her wrist burned faintly, as if confirming the truth. She was no mere servant. She was a descendant of the hunters, a threat to the very court that had enslaved her. Kaelin quickly gathered the scroll and dagger, hiding them beneath her cloak, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew she could not reveal this yet, not without proof, not without a plan. The vampires would kill her on sight if they suspected, and the archives were no place to linger. She finished her task with mechanical precision, her hands steady despite the storm within, and returned to the servant quarters under the watchful eyes of the overseers. That night, she studied the scroll by the dim light of a stolen candle, piecing together its secrets. The runes spoke of a ritual, a way to awaken the hunter's power, but it required the dagger and a confrontation with the court's heart. The risk was immense, but so was the reward. Days turned to weeks, and Kaelin carried her secret like a second skin. She trained herself in secret, practicing with the dagger in the dead of night, its weight becoming familiar in her grip. The scroll hinted at weaknesses in vampire strength, sunlight, silver, and the blood of their own kind, and she began to observe the court with new eyes. She noticed the way Darius flinched at the mention of the old wars, the way Seraphine's gaze lingered on the throne with unspoken ambition. The gala, a grand celebration of the court's dominance, was fast approaching, and Kaelin saw it as her chance. She would serve, as always, but this time she would listen, watch, and wait for the moment to strike. The night of the gala arrived, the castle transformed into a vision of splendor. Chandeliers blazed with candlelight, their reflections dancing on the polished floors. Vampires in velvet and silk glided through the hall, their laughter a sharp contrast to the silence of the servants who moved among them. Kaelin carried a tray of wine, her head bowed, but her eyes darted to every corner. Prince Darius stood at the center, his voice ringing out as he toasted to their eternal rule. Lady Seraphine, resplendent in a gown of crimson, moved through the crowd, her smile a mask for the envy that simmered beneath. It was then that disaster struck. As Kaelin passed Seraphine, the vampire's foot lashed out, tripping her. The tray crashed to the floor, wine splattering across Seraphine's dress, and the hall fell silent. Gasps echoed as the vampires turned, their eyes gleaming with amusement and disdain. "Look at the human wretch," Seraphine sneered, her voice cutting through the air. "Does she think scrubbing will earn her a place among us?" Prince Darius stepped forward, his laughter cold and hollow. Let her dream. Her kind are fit only for dust and shadows. Kaelin's cheeks burned, but she bit back her retort, her hands clenching around the hidden dagger. "One day you'll see me differently," she muttered, her voice too low to carry. But Seraphine heard, and her smile twisted into a snarl. "Take her to the dungeons," she commanded. "She served her last night." The overseers seized Kaelin, their grips bruising, and dragged her from the hall. The gala resumed, the incident forgotten by all but her. In the damp darkness of the dungeons, chained to the wall, Kaelin's resolve hardened. The scroll had promised power, and the dagger at her side was her key. The court planned her banishment at dawn, a public execution under the blood moon, but she vowed to turn their judgment into her triumph. As the hours ticked by, she whispered to herself, tracing the crescent mark on her wrist. The hunter's blood ran in her veins, and tomorrow the vampires would learn the cost of their mockery. The night deepened, and a faint sound broke the silence, a shuffle of boots, the jingle of keys. A figure emerged from the shadows, a vampire with a scarred face and eyes that held a flicker of doubt. His name was Varen, a guard who had watched Kaelin's quiet defiance with growing curiosity. He unlocked her chains, his voice a low growl. "I've seen that mark before," he said. "The hunter's blood." "You're no ordinary servant." Kaelin met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Then help me." "I can end their tyranny." Varen hesitated, then nodded. "At dawn, they'll gather for your sentencing. We'll use the light. Sunlight weakens them. But we need a plan." Together, they devised a strategy, drawing on the scroll's lore. Varen would rally a few outcasts, vampires disillusioned with the court, while Kaelin prepared to reveal her power. The dungeons became their war room, the cold stone a canvas for their hope. As the first rays of dawn approached, Kaelin felt the dagger pulse against her skin, its silver light a beacon. In the dark, the court awaited her defeat, but she carried the weight of her bloodline, ready to turn the tables on the elite who had mocked her for too long. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow slits of the dungeon walls, a thin golden thread that pierced the oppressive darkness where Kaelin had spent the night. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mold and the faint metallic tang of old blood that clung to the stone. Her wrist ached where the chains had bitten into her skin, but the pain was a distant echo compared to the fire that now burned in her chest. The dagger, hidden beneath the folds of her tattered cloak, pulsed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, its silver hilt warm against her side. Varen had left hours ago, his promise to rally the outcasts echoing in her mind, and now she stood alone, awaiting the moment that would define her fate or forge her destiny. The court of Valdrath had never been a place of mercy, but today it would become a stage for judgment unlike any before. The vampires had gathered in the great hall, their numbers swelling as word of the human servant's defiance spread. Prince Darius sat upon his throne, a towering structure of obsidian and gold, his sapphire eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and irritation. Beside him, Lady Seraphine lounged with a predatory grace, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the pale marble floor. The nobles, clad in velvet and silk, whispered among themselves, their voices a susurrus of anticipation. This was to be a spectacle, a public banishment, a reminder of their supremacy over the fragile lives of humans. Kaelin was dragged from the dungeons by two overseers, their scarred hands gripping her arms with bruising force. The journey through the castle was a blur of torchlit corridors and echoing footsteps, the weight of the dagger a secret comfort against her thigh. As they approached the great hall, the sound of the gathered vampires grew louder, a chorus of hisses and laughter that sent a shiver down her spine. The doors swung open, revealing the sea of pale faces turned toward her, their eyes gleaming with hunger and disdain. She was pushed forward, her knees striking the cold floor before the throne, and the hall fell silent, save for the faint crackle of the torches. "Rise, human," Darius commanded, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of centuries. "You stand accused of insolence, of defiling the sanctity of our gala with your clumsiness. What have you to say before we cast you into the sun?" Kaelin lifted her head, her gray eyes meeting his, and for a moment the hall seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the dagger's power stirring, a tingling sensation that spread from her wrist where the crescent mark pulsed faintly beneath her sleeve. Her voice, when it came, was steady, though her heart raced. "I say you're wrong, Prince Darius. I am not what you think. I am no mere servant." A ripple of laughter broke out among the nobles, and Seraphine's lips curled into a sneer. "Delusions of grandeur, sister? You, a human wretch, dare to challenge us?" But Kaelin did not flinch. She rose to her feet, her hands trembling as she pushed back her sleeve to reveal the crescent mark, its edges glowing with a soft silver light. The laughter died, replaced by a murmur of unease. "This mark," she said, her voice rising, "is the sign of the hunter's bloodline, a lineage that once stood against your kind. I am their descendant, and this court will know my power." The words hung in the air, a challenge that seemed to suck the breath from the room. Darius leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, while Seraphine's expression shifted from mockery to something darker, curiosity tinged with fear. Kaelin seized the moment, reaching for the dagger hidden beneath her cloak. The overseers lunged to stop her, but the blade seemed to move of its own accord, slipping into her hand with a flash of silver. As her fingers closed around the hilt, a wave of energy surged through her, and the hall was bathed in a blinding light. The vampires recoiled, their hisses filling the air as the light struck them. The dagger's power was raw, unrefined, but it carried the ancient strength of the hunters, a force that weakened the undead. Kaelin felt it too, a rush of clarity, a connection to the bloodline she had only begun to understand. She raised the blade, its tip pointing toward Darius, and shouted, "This is my proof. The hunter's blood runs in me, and I will not be your slave." Chaos erupted. The nobles surged to their feet, some drawing weapons, others retreating toward the shadowed corners of the hall. Darius rose from his throne, his face a mask of fury, but the light from the dagger held him at bay. "Seize her!" he roared, and the overseers charged, their movements sluggish under the weapon's influence. Kaelin swung the dagger in a wide arc, the light flaring brighter, and the nearest overseer stumbled, clutching his chest as if burned. She darted toward the center of the hall, her heart pounding, searching for Veyron among the outcasts she hoped he had gathered. From the back of the room, a figure emerged. Veyron, his scarred face set with determination. Beside him stood a handful of vampires, their eyes wary but resolute. They were the outcasts, those who had grown weary of the court's tyranny, and now they saw in Kaelin a chance for change. Veyron raised a hand, signaling to the others, and they moved with purpose, pulling levers hidden along the walls. The great shutters above the hall groaned open, and sunlight poured in, a golden flood that sent the vampires into a frenzy. The effect was immediate. The nobles screamed, their skin blistering under the unaccustomed rays, and Darius shielded his eyes, his voice a snarl of rage. Treachery. "Close the shutters!" But the outcasts held their ground, their own resistance to sunlight bolstered by their defiance. Kaelin felt the dagger's power amplify with the light, her mark glowing brighter, and she knew this was her moment. She turned to face the throne, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is your end, Darius." The hunters have returned. Seraphine, standing near the throne, watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Her envy of her brother's power had always been a quiet fire, but now it flared into something new, admiration for the human girl who dared to challenge them. She stepped forward, her hand raised to stop the guards, but her hesitation cost her. Darius seized her arm, his grip bruising. "You will not betray me, sister," he hissed, and dragged her back toward the shadows. The hall became a battlefield, the sunlight dividing friend from foe. Varen fought alongside Kaelin, his sword clashing with the overseer's blades, while the outcasts worked to maintain the shutters. Kaelin moved with a grace she had never known, the dagger guiding her strikes, its light a shield against the vampire's attacks. She felt the hunter's blood singing in her veins, a legacy of strength that had lain dormant for generations. But the power was new, and she stumbled as an overseer's whip lashed toward her, the tip grazing her arm. Blood welled from the cut, a stark red against her pale skin, and for a moment the hall seemed as still. The vampires froze, their eyes fixed on the wound, and Kaelin realized the truth. Their weakness lay not just in sunlight, but in the blood of the hunters. She pressed her hand to the cut, smearing the blood onto the dagger's blade, and the weapon flared with a brilliance that forced even Darius to his knees. "This is my blood," she cried, "the blood of those you feared. Yield or be destroyed." The outcasts cheered, their voices a ragged chorus, but the nobles rallied, their numbers overwhelming. Darius rose, his face twisted with rage, and summoned a dark mist that began to choke the sunlight. "You cannot win, girl," he snarled. "Your blood may burn, but we are legion." Kaelin felt the mist pressing against her, the dagger's light dimming, and despair crept into her heart. Varen fell beside her, a gash across his chest, and the outcasts began to falter. But then a voice cut through the haze. Seraphine's. "Enough, Darius!" she shouted, stepping into the light, her skin blistering, but her resolve unbroken. "She's more than we thought." "Let her speak." The mist wavered, and Darius turned on his sister, his hand raised to strike. Kaelin seized the opportunity, lunging forward with the dagger, its blood-stained edge aimed at the prince's heart. The blade stopped short, held by an invisible force, and Darius laughed, a sound that chilled her to the bone. "You've spirit, girl," he said, "but spirit alone won't save you. We'll take your blood, your power, and end this farce." He gestured, and the overseers closed in, their chains rattling. Kaelin fought, her strength waning, but the dagger's light flickered, a final defiance against the darkness. The outcasts were subdued, Varen unconscious at her feet, and Seraphine stood frozen, her choice unmade. As the overseers bound her, Kaelin's mind raced. The trial had turned against her, but the revelation of her bloodline had sown doubt among the vampires. The hunter's power was real, and the court's unity was fracturing. She was dragged back to the dungeons. The dagger pried from her grasp, but the crescent mark on her wrist glowed faintly, a promise of what was to come. The blood moon rose higher, its red light seeping through the bars, and Kaelin whispered to herself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The hours that followed were a blur of pain and planning. Varen was thrown into the cell beside her, his breathing shallow but steady. The outcasts, scattered but alive, would regroup. She knew it. Seraphine's hesitation was a crack in the court's armor, and Darius's fear was a weapon she could wield. The dagger was lost, but its power lingered in her blood, and the scroll's ritual remained unfinished. As dawn approached once more, Kaelin resolved to escape, to awaken the full strength of her heritage, and to turn the tables on the vampire elite who had mocked her for so long. The dungeons of Valdrath were a tomb of despair, their walls slick with moisture, and etched with the scratches of those who had come before Kaelin, their hopes extinguished under the weight of vampire rule. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, a fitting shroud for the prisoners who languished within. Kaelin sat against the cold stone, her wrist raw from the iron shackles that bound her, her mind a whirlwind of strategy and resolve. Beside her, Varin lay still, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, the gash across his torso a testament to the battle they had lost in the great hall. The dagger was gone, wrested from her grasp by Darius's overseers, but its power lingered in the crescent mark on her wrist, a faint glow that pulsed like a heartbeat in the dimness. The trial had been a turning point, a revelation that had shaken the court to its core. The hunter's bloodline, dormant for centuries, had awakened in her, and the vampire's reaction, fear masked by rage, confirmed its threat. Yet the victory had been fleeting, the sunlight trap overwhelmed by Darius's dark mist, and now she was a prisoner once more. But Kaelin was not defeated. The outcasts had seen her power, and Seraphine's hesitation had planted a seed of doubt among the nobles. The court's unity was fracturing, and she intended to exploit every crack. As the hours ticked by, the blood moon's red light filtered through the barred window, casting an eerie glow across the cell. Kaelin's thoughts turned to the scroll, its cryptic runes promising a ritual to awaken the full strength of her heritage. The dagger had been the key, but its loss was not the end. Her blood, the hunter's blood, was the true source. She pressed her fingers to the cut on her arm, the wound still tender, and felt a surge of energy. If she could reach the archives again, she might find another way, a spell or artifact to amplify her power. But first, she needed to escape. A soft scrape broke the silence, and Kaelin tensed, her eyes darting to the shadows. A figure emerged, Seraphine, her crimson gown torn, her pale face marred by a blister from the sunlight. She moved with a predator's grace, her eyes wary but lacking their usual malice. "I've come to free you," she said, her voice low, almost reluctant. "Darius plans to drain your blood at midnight, to steal your power for himself." "I won't let that happen." Kaelin stared, suspicion warring with hope. "Why? You mocked me, tripped me. Why help now?" Seraphine's lips tightened. "Because you're more than we thought, and I tire of my brother's shadow. Free yourself, and I'll consider an alliance." She unlocked the shackles with a key stolen from an overseer, then stepped back, her expression unreadable. Kaelin rubbed her wrists, the circulation returning with a sting, and nodded. "Then we move now. Varin needs help, and the outcasts need a leader." Seraphine hesitated, then lifted Varin, her strength surprising for her slender frame. Together they slipped from the cell, the castle's corridors a maze of torchlight and shadow. The guards were distracted, preparing for the midnight ritual, and the pair moved swiftly, dodging patrols with the skill of those who had learned to survive. They reached the servant quarters, where a handful of outcasts waited, vampires with haunted eyes, humans with scarred hands. Varin was laid on a cot, his wounds tended by a woman named Lyrian, a former healer turned rebel. The group listened as Kaelin recounted the trial, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on her. "The hunter's blood is our weapon," she said. "Darius fears it, and Seraphine's seen the truth. We strike at midnight, before he can use my blood against us." The outcasts murmured, their doubt giving way to determination. Lyrian handed Kaelin a crude blade, its edge dull but serviceable. "It's not silver," she said, "but it'll do until we get the dagger back." Seraphine remained silent, her presence a tense undercurrent, but she did not leave. The plan was simple but desperate. The outcasts would create a diversion, setting fires in the lower levels to draw the guards away, while Kaelin and Seraphine infiltrated the Great Hall to confront Darius. The archives held a mirror shard, a relic mentioned in the scroll which could reflect sunlight even under the blood moon. If they could retrieve it, Kaelin's blood might amplify its power, turning the ritual against the prince. The risk was immense, but the alternative, death or enslavement, was unthinkable. As midnight approached, the castle erupted in chaos. Flames licked at the lower walls, smoke curling through the corridors, and the guards raced to contain the blaze. Kaelin and Seraphine moved through the archives, the shelves a blur as they searched. Kaelin's fingers brushed a glass shard, its surface etched with runes, and she felt the same pulse she had with the dagger. "This is it," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. Seraphine nodded, her eyes on the door. "Hurry. They'll notice us soon." They reached the Great Hall just as the ritual began. Darius stood at an altar, the dagger in his hand, its blade stained with Kaelin's blood from the earlier wound. The nobles formed a circle, their chants a low hum that vibrated through the stone. Kaelin's heart sank. Her blood was already in play, and the dagger's power was turning against her. But she raised the mirror shard, her cut hand pressing against it, and the runes flared to life. Light exploded from the shard, a brilliant beam that cut through the darkness, reflecting off the hall's polished surfaces. The vampires shrieked, their skin blistering, and Darius staggered, the dagger slipping from his grasp. Kaelin lunged, the crude blade in her other hand, and drove it toward his chest. The prince caught her wrist, his strength overwhelming, but Seraphine intervened, her own blade slashing at his arm. "This ends now, brother," she hissed. The battle was fierce. The outcasts stormed the hall, their numbers bolstered by the diversion, and the nobles fought back with claws and mist. Kaelin felt the mirror shard's power growing, her blood feeding it, and she directed the light toward Darius. The beam struck him full force, and he fell to his knees, his screams echoing as his skin charred. Seraphine stepped back, her face a mask of shock, but she did not aid him further. Virine arrived, leaning on Lyrian, his wounds bandaged, but his spirit unbroken. "The lower levels are ours," he rasped. "The guards are scattered." Kaelin nodded, her focus on Darius. She retrieved the dagger, its hilt warm in her hand, and held it alongside the mirror shard. The two artifacts hummed in unison, and she felt the hunter's power surge, a wave that pushed the nobles back. "Yield," she commanded, her voice amplified by the light. "Yield, or face the sun's wrath." Darius, weakened but defiant, glared up at her. "You'll never rule us, girl." "We'll rise again." But his words lacked conviction, and the nobles began to falter, their loyalty shaken. Seraphine stepped forward, her decision made. "I stand with her," she declared, and the outcasts cheered. The battle waned as the light held, the vampires retreating to the shadows. Kaelin stood victorious, the dagger and mirror shard her symbols of power, but the cost was clear. The hall was scarred, the outcasts wounded, and Darius's threat lingered. She turned to Seraphine, a tentative trust forming. "We'll need your help to rebuild," she said. Seraphine nodded, her envy replaced by a new purpose. As the blood moon watched, the first light of true dawn crept over Valdrath, a promise of change. Kaelin knew the fight was not over. Darius would recover, and the court's fractures would deepen. But for now, she had turned the tables, her hunter's blood a beacon for a new era. The dawn that followed the rebellion in Valdrath was unlike any the castle had seen in centuries. A soft golden light that pierced the heavy clouds and bathed the spires in a warmth the vampires had long forgotten. The great hall, once a symbol of unyielding power, now bore the scars of battle. Charred walls from the mirror shard's beams, shattered chandeliers scattered like broken stars across the marble floor, and the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. Bodies lay where they had fallen, both outcast and noble, a grim reminder of the cost of change. Kaelin stood at the center of it all, the dagger in one hand and the mirror shard in the other, their combined glow fading as the sun rose higher. Her body ached from the fight, her arm wound throbbing, but her spirit soared. The hunter's bloodline, a fire that no darkness could extinguish. Prince Darius knelt before her, his regal attire torn and his sapphire eyes dimmed with defeat. The dark mist he had summoned had dissipated under the relentless light, leaving him vulnerable, his immortality a fragile veil against the hunter's power. The nobles who remained, those who had not fled into the shadows, watched in stunned silence, their loyalty shattered by Seraphine's defection. She stood beside Kaelin now, her crimson gown stained with ash, her face a complex mask of regret and resolve. Varen, supported by Lyrian, leaned against a pillar, his wounds bandaged, a faint smile breaking through his pain. The outcasts gathered around, their numbers swollen by defectors from the guard, all eyes on Kaelin, the orphan who had become their savior. "You have won this day, girl," Darius rasped, his voice a shadow of its former command. "But what now? Will you slaughter us all as your ancestors tried?" Kaelin met his gaze, the dagger's hilt cool in her palm. The temptation was there, a swift strike to end the tyranny that had defined her life, but she saw beyond vengeance. The scroll had spoken not just of destruction, but of balance, a way for hunters and vampires to coexist. "No," she said firmly, "I offer a truce. Your rule ends, but your lives do not. Valdrath will change, humans freed, outcasts heard, and the blood hunt stopped. Swear loyalty to this new order, or leave forever." The hall murmured, the nobles exchanging glances. Seraphine stepped forward, her voice steady. "I swear it. Darius, it's time. Our ways have poisoned us." The prince's shoulders slumped, the weight of centuries pressing down. "Very well," he muttered. "A truce?" He rose slowly, extending a hand, and Kaelin clasped it, the crescent mark on her wrist glowing briefly, a seal on their pact. The days that followed were a whirlwind of transformation. Kaelin, with Seraphine's guidance, dismantled the old hierarchy. The dungeons were emptied, their prisoners, humans and vampires alike, given freedom and purpose. Varen was appointed head of the new guard, a force dedicated to protection rather than oppression. Lyrian oversaw the healing chambers, using her knowledge to mend the wounded and teach the vampires to sustain themselves without bloodshed. The archives, once a repository of secrets, were open to all. The scroll's wisdom shared to foster understanding. Kaelin performed the ritual in full under the blood moon's watchful eye, her blood mingling with the dagger and mirror shard to create a ward, a barrier that protected Valdrath from external threats while ensuring no one within abused power. Darius, stripped of his throne, retreated to the towers, his pride wounded but his cunning intact. He watched Kaelin with a mix of resentment and reluctant respect, occasionally offering counsel that she weighed carefully. Seraphine became her closest ally, her envy transformed into a drive to build a better court. Together, they negotiated with nearby human villages, ending the raids and establishing trade. The vampires learned to feed from willing donors or synthetic sources brewed in the alchemist's labs, a shift that eased the ancient hatreds. Yet peace was fragile. Whispers of dissent rippled through the nobles, some fleeing to form splinter groups in the shadowed forests beyond Valdrath. Kaelin knew Darius's truce was tentative, his ambition a sleeping beast. One night, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, Varen joined her, his scars healing under the moon's glow, "You've done what no hunter before could," he said, "but they'll test you." Kaelin nodded, the dagger at her side a constant reminder. Let them. The bloodline endures. As months passed, Valdrath flourished. The blood moon, once a symbol of dread, became a time of celebration, stories of the rebellion shared around fires that welcomed all. Kaelin, no longer the mocked orphan, ruled with wisdom, her gray eyes seeing the potential in every soul. And though the shadows lingered, the light she had ignited ensured they would never fully reclaim the night. In the end, the tables had turned not just for Kaelin, but for all of Valdrath, a testament to the power of hidden blood and unyielding resolve.